My name's Paul Hill. I'm the Director of Mission Operations at JSC. At the time of the Columbia accident, I was a Shuttle and Space Station Flight Director. And after the accident, one of the things that I did was run a team called the Early Sightings Assessment Team. 10 years ago, on the day of the Columbia accident, I was sitting in a gym in League City watching a YMCA basketball team, watching my youngest daughter play. Sitting next to me was Corey Hobaugh, whose husband, Charlie, was actually the Capcom on console at the time for the Columbia entry. First indication I had that anything had happened was when my wife walked in the gym where she was supposed to be somewhere with my oldest daughter. And by the look on her face, I could tell that something serious had happened. And apparently it had. When it comes to executing the operation, one of the things MOD does particularly well is we execute the way we train. We generally have really well thought out contingency actions. Something as catastrophic as loss of a vehicle is certainly no exception. So when we lost comm with the vehicle, the flight director or the flight control team were doing all the normal things trying to reestablish comm. When it became clear that we were not regaining comm and it looked like we had lost the vehicle, John Shannon, in fact, was up in the VIP suite with some folks. He was the first to pull out the contingency action plan and start running down the list of specific actions we needed to take to secure data in the building, to establish the right communications with folks at a higher level in the agency. Phil Engeloff, who at the time was sitting on the MOD console behind the flight director, he and John talked right away. John, in fact, handed him the plan. And between Phil and the on-console flight director, Leroy Kane, they started walking down the plan. In fact, people have probably seen the video clip of Leroy telling the GC to lock the doors, which is sort of the first step to start securing the data as the flight control team saw it. And then they just went through the plan very methodically. And like everything else, when it comes time to execute, they went through that in a very business-like way. And when it was all over, it was only then that they actually started experiencing the real human experience of what had just happened and the significant loss of this crew. The day after the accident, we were having a meeting of the flight director office. Well, we were all talking about, now what do we need to be focusing on? Some of it was, what should we be talking with the flight controllers and our MOD community about, just managing the human reaction that everybody was having. After we got through that initial discussion, John Shannon pulled me aside and says, hey, come with me over to the control center. I want to show you something. And we walked over here, and on the second floor, we have a management room, essentially. And in that room were a handful of people around a table that literally was overflowing with individual pieces of paper. On the wall was a large map of the United States, and they were sticking Post-its or stickies on this map all over the place. And it was mild chaos as we were collecting these individual reports from the public. And these things varied from somebody that called and said, hey, I saw the orbiter fly overhead, I saw it crash, to actually there were some that said, the birds told me before the launch that this was going to happen, and I feel bad that I should have told NASA. And John looked at me and says, look, we need somebody to pour through this and figure out if there's anything real in here that could help us ferret out what caused this. See what you can do. And over a couple of day period, I pulled in a handful of folks, primarily experienced flight directors, and we sort of divvied up the big pile of paper and started looking for any clue that was in this that could help. And I'd say within 2 days, we discovered a number of things. And that was, independent of the public reports, there were some folks that had taken pictures of the shuttle as it flew overhead in the western United States, and some folks that had taken video. And that was our first inkling that we might actually have data and actual recordings that could lead us then to what was happening to the orbiter as it flew overhead over the western United States. After a day or two, and when we started realizing that some of these reports actually had pictures, some of these reports had video, we started then prioritizing all of the reports. So we didn't throw any out, including some of the wilder ones. But there were some of them where they have video from a security camera in an area that the shuttle flew overhead, and so they just sent us the tape just in case. It didn't really help. But we started finding pictures of the orbiter. Of course, you know, the orbiter is a white dot in the sky. It wasn't like a picture of the shuttle. Same thing with video. And so we made our first priority, anything that looked like actual data, where actual data is an actual picture or video of the orbiter as it flew overhead, or if somebody had confidence that they saw something fall out of the sky that they personally attributed to coming from that white dot as it flew overhead. Although those also were sort of dubious value. But our real focus was on something that we might get something tangible from the public with real data, not just a report. Those things we prioritized at the highest level, and we divided those up amongst about half a dozen experienced flight directors and some other experienced folks from MOD to then take those from that high priority list and start reaching out to those individual people in the public, all of whom were unaffiliated with NASA. Most of them were amateur photographers. We later found out that most of the amateur photographers either knew each other or they were affiliated, at least by reputation, and had a habit of taking pictures and videos of orbiters as they deorbited during a mission, which was good for us in this particular case. And we had no idea how organized these guys were, even informally. And then as we started getting these pictures in, as we started getting the videos in, then we started pulling on, well, what can we use these for? What can we actually learn from these? And I'd say in the middle of the first week after the accident, we were still kind of scratching our heads. Is this really going to tell us anything? And about that time, one of our experienced flight dynamics officers, a fellow named Chris Edelin, who now is a flight director, Chris walked in and had this big smile on his face, and he pops a tape down, puts it in the player, and he shows us a picture of the orbiter. And by then we had seen a lot of these videos that show this white dot in the sky. This was another one. And in this case, the orbiter flies in front of something really bright. And Chris turns it off and turns around and smiles like this was the eureka moment that we should all join him in. And I had no idea where he was going with this. And he said, that bright dot, that's Venus. And we know exactly where this photographer was standing because he had a GPS unit and he snapped his exact coordinates. Since we know exactly where he was and we know exactly the time that the orbiter crossed in front of Venus, we also know exactly where the orbiter was in three-dimensional space. So because of that, we know exactly, we can do relative motion analysis on the orbiter in this video, number one. And number two, we had these other videos that we also have GPS recorders on, or GPS units where those photographers knew where they were. And in many cases, they had video of the GPS unit, so we can correlate the time from this video to the next video to the next video. And at that moment, our first inclination was, well, this at least allows us to anchor all of these videos so we can say exactly what their time sequence is. And eventually, and this was actually shown in the public, we were able to piece together a video that was pretty much unbroken from the California coast all the way to the Texas-New Mexico border of that white dot flying across the continental United States. And it started with that crossing in front of Venus. Within a few hours, the thing that also occurred to us is, well, if we can do that relative motion analysis on that orbiter on that one frame, perhaps we can also do that relative motion analysis on those white dots that are coming off the orbiter. And perhaps that will allow us to do ballistic analysis, where that'll tell us a couple of things. One, might give us an idea of what that is that's coming off, like how big is it? You know, so did we lose a main landing gear door, or say one of the main landing gear, or the individual tiles coming off? And based on those ballistics, or where that thing's flying in the sky, where is it going to land on the ground, so we could send somebody out west to go pick it up? Because at that point, we had not yet discovered the onboard recorders that actually gave us the clue to what happened in the left wing during entry. So if we weren't able to go out west and find some component like that, the fear was we weren't going to be able to identify exactly what the failure was that caused us to lose that crew and that vehicle. So I'd say we had about 3 phases of this part of the investigation. The first one was discovering that there was meaningful video, meaningful pictures that we could use, and that we could do something as sophisticated as any kind of time sequencing or relative motion or ballistic analysis. And actually, exactly 1 week after the accident, I had an epiphany at about 3 o'clock in the morning, woke up, started writing it down, and then finally just gave up and came into work. So when my team came in at about 6 or 7 in the morning, there I was, having written out all these charts. And what I explained to these guys is I now know what we're going to do. We're going to take all of these videos, we're going to time sequence all of them, we're going to do ballistic analysis on each of those white dots, then we're going to generate footprints at altitude and on the ground, all of which we'll then prioritize, that will then hand back to the teams of folks that are going to go out west to potentially search for things. And I had a handful of trajectory experts in the room with me, and each one of them, including Chris Edelin, told me that the piece that they were responsible for. So Chris, a big part of what he was doing was time synchronizing all of these videos. I had a handful of other guys like John Gowan, Ron Spencer, and a number of other folks, all from MOD Flight Dynamics. And to go from time synchronizing the videos to ballistic analysis to actual trajectories and footprints, each one of them said it was not possible for us to do. And in less than a week, each one of them had solved their piece of the problem that made that whole process possible, including the thing that they thought, each one of them individually thought was impossible. So by the end of that week, we turned that on into a no-kidding process where we prioritized the videos on the ones we had the most likelihood to being able to time synchronize and get this data off of. And then we had a handful of these guys that the data all just walked through almost like an assembly line, until out at the other end came footprints and a time synchronized video that we then hooked up with all the other videos. Once we started doing that and reporting that at the agency level, there was obviously interest in getting those footprints and deciding what our level of confidence was and which of those we should send people out west for. There was also a lot of discussion to try to correlate some of our ballistic analysis on, like, how big is this object coming off? And just based on the video that we had, we couldn't actually make an estimate on how large something was, because we didn't know the mass. If we knew the mass, we could have told you how large it was. If we knew how large it was, we could tell you what the mass was, but we didn't have enough information to fill in both of those blanks. Because of that, we had a number of people that would come by our team periodically and ask questions like that. And some of our guys would give them information or answer questions on how big a particular object was or where it was on the ground. And quickly it became clear we needed to organize not just how we were analyzing the data, but figuring out what our confidence level was in the data, and when we release the data, even to the NASA team, how do we characterize what our level of confidence is in it? Because we didn't want to run the risk that somebody would now go to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board or to the press and tell them something confidently that we actually didn't know, that we were speculating on or that we had made assumptions on. Which is why we definitely organized with a series of flight directors being responsible for how do we meter that data out, how do we tell the public. Well, recall that when this investigation started, we weren't fully confident what caused the breakup, although the leading suspicion was the foam strike, and the leading suspicion also was foam strike damage to the left main landing gear door. So from the beginning, the investigation was kind of focused on that. And because it was the loss of an orbiter, the Orbiter Project Office was overall responsible for the NASA part of pulling all that data together. And from the beginning, the Orbiter Project Office really did have sort of an iron-fisted control for evaluating the data, pulling the data in, deciding how to characterize that data at the agency level and an outreach to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. My team was kind of this odd, ad hoc team almost. I mean, again, you know, it started with John Shannon grabbing me and saying, hey, look at that and see what you can do with it. So we didn't really fit in. It wasn't, you know, my team's work wasn't in some contingency action plan that we were intending to do. So I was kind of on the outside. This whole team was sort of on the outside trying to get in. And because of some of the footprint work that we did in particular, we had a number of folks, including from the Orbiter Project Office, continuing to come to us and want to pull data in. And we quickly tried to slow that down and only feed them the data after we were confident that they could rely on it. And that started causing friction from the beginning. Now, our normal experience in the operational world is we work contingencies like this for things that we have to resolve maybe in the next hour, sometimes the next couple of days. usually within the next week or so, because the orbiter has to land, or we have some next spacewalk we have to do on space station. And I would say that the tone during the first few weeks of the investigation, if not for the first few months, was sort of colored by that same thinking, not just on the MOD side, but across the community, including the Orbiter Project Office, which added to the sense of urgency. So, what did not become apparent to me for some time was the folks that were running those forums in the Orbiter Project Office saw us as kind of this cowboy bunch of guys that were on the outside that were working against them. And that actually was not clear to me for some time. In fact, I knew there was some aggravation that we weren't feeding them some of this data more quickly. But I was concerned that if we fed them data that we hadn't finished the analysis on, hadn't fully vetted, say some of this radar data that we later concluded was noise, I didn't want to feed that into the system and have them starting to take action and have that influence the investigation if we didn't know that it was good data. And our reluctance to do that just aggravated them more. 4 guys that already saw us as kind of an outside bunch. And that definitely got in the way of communication. It got in the way of us being able to help them. So even something as simple as making them aware that some of the radar data out west wasn't valid, that the Orbiter Project Office didn't need to be putting pressure on the guys searching for hardware on the ground to go out west. One of the reasons we had trouble influencing that was this very dynamic of them seeing us as an outside bunch of guys that weren't giving them the data that they were asking for as quickly as they were asking for it. The key takeaway on this one is complicated. The obvious answer is be aware that, especially the folks that are nearest to the center of whatever the catastrophe is, or the accident, say loss of an orbiter, recognize the pressures they're under. Recognize that, like the rest of us, they're trying to find what caused this. And they also are concerned about how this is being presented outside of their team or outside of the agency. And make sure that we are coordinating even the human element of this much earlier. Now I say it's complicated because I made the rounds early on, including with some folks that I knew were aggravated with us in the Orbiter Project Office. I would make the rounds early on within a week or so of the accident. As soon as I started hearing there were folks that were not happy with us, I started seeing some of the senior leaders to find out, hey, what is it we can do that would improve this? And it didn't help much. I'm confident it didn't help much just because of the emotion at the time and the huge sense of loss in the community. So, when I look back on this, I'm not sure how much more we could have done differently other than recognize that this is going to be a painful ordeal to get through. At least in an environment like that, during this accident investigation, we thought we were going to fly, or the goal was to fly in less than 6 months. So there was this huge sense of urgency, not just for our responsibility back to this crew that we clearly let down from STS-107, but to then resolve, do duty back to those folks, solve this problem, understand it, and then be ready to fly the next flight and do the right thing for the next crew as well. And all of that, I'm not sure there's a way to get through this if you still have that sense of urgency that completely diffuses all of that emotion, especially since ultimately it came at the loss of one of our crews. There were kind of 2 phases or 2 distinct different types of data. There was pre-breakup data and post-breakup data. Post-breakup, all of which was focused over Central and East Texas, and it was literally after the breakup of the orbiter, large things falling out of the sky, and the FAA and the NTSB had a lot of data from air traffic control radars where you could see large things falling out of the sky. And there was also some video in particular from an Apache helicopter up in the Corsicana area where you actually can see the breakup, and you can see things like the shuttle main engines flying further downrange. All of those things were picked up on radar pretty effectively. And so there was one team of people in Texas that were using that information to try to send the people on the ground that were looking for parts of the orbiter as well as the astronauts to areas that the radar suggested all of that hardware was laying. Now, we used a similar process for the data out west, In fact, my team worked with the NTSB and the FAA and the Department of Defense to look at all of our civilian and all of our military radar to see these white dots that are coming off the orbiter. Can we also find radar hits from those white dots that would also improve our confidence level in these large footprints that we found on the ground, or that we propagated to the ground to send people out to? On the plus side, we came up with some fascinating math that allowed us to generate these footprints from things that were falling from 200,000 feet in the air. On the bad side, some of these footprints were 200 square miles. The best ones were 10 to 20 square miles. That's a lot of ground, especially in the Badlands in the western part of the United States, to send somebody out to look for something that could be a scorched piece of tile that might just look like any other rock laying there. So if we could find a radar track, that might take us from 10 or 20 square miles to 1 square mile. Now we could send people out there with actual hopes of finding something. But we were finding all of these random radar hits that it was difficult to tell, is this in the noise, kind of like static on a radio, or is this actual radar? Because when you go looking for something like that, it's kind of like at night when you're driving, sometimes the eyes will fire and you'll see little bright spots. When you're looking at radar, sometimes when you know you're looking for a small object, the noise can fool you into thinking you're actually seeing what you're looking for. After we had followed a number of those types of bunny trails, my team organized some folks from engineering to pull together some components from the shuttle, which comprised full pieces of the orbiter itself as well as small samples of the materials. And we sent them up to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where the Air Force Research Lab did some radar testing for us. And unfortunately, what that testing concluded is that for any of the materials on the shuttle, especially on the outside of the shuttle, so for anything that was likely coming off the orbiter, if it didn't come off in a large component, where a large component would be like entire main landing gear door, or an entire landing gear, or an entire piece of a leading edge, it was virtually untrackable on radar, unless that piece was going to fall almost right on the radar. And in most cases, the radars that we had data from were hundreds of miles from the flight path of the orbiter. So the lesson to us was, in all cases, those things that we were chasing and hoping were going to help improve our confidence in the footprints really was just noise in the radar. We weren't really tracking anything coming off the orbiter. It was good to know that. On the other hand, it was a bad thing for us to fully confirm, because that meant we really didn't have a chance of shrinking down those footprints to send folks out west. Now, about the time we were learning that, we also discovered the MADS recorders in East Texas or Western Louisiana, and those recorders had data on them that we did not have in data that was sent to the ground from the orbiter during entry. And that data allowed the engineering team to reconstruct what happened in the wing. In the absence of that, my guess is we would have been sending hundreds of people out west to search some of these 10, 20, or even 100-mile footprints. So I'm glad it didn't come to that. And like I said, it's unfortunate that we had data that proved we probably weren't going to be able to use the radar to shrink it down more than that, but we gave it a hell of a try. One of the lessons that we learned was it is definitely important for us to do similar radar characterization of the materials of especially our human-rated spacecraft. So a spacecraft that we intend to bring back into the atmosphere with people riding on it definitely makes sense to prepare us for some next breakup case like this. We ought to test that radar and have a good idea what our chances are of tracking either the full vehicle or individual components if we were to have a high-altitude breakup. It would definitely help us on a day like this. Now, the other thing that we did learn from that is we definitely have to have tighter coupling between a team that's working something like, say, pre-breakup data analysis versus post-breakup data analysis, because the quality of the radar data was definitely different. Post-breakup, you have large sections of the orbiter falling out of the sky with really solid radar tracks. I mean, in fact, if you look at the radar, it looks like you are raining all kinds of hardware, which you are, out of the sky. And there were a lot of folks in Texas that had the same level of confidence in some of these things that we were able to show later were just ghosts or noise in the radar data pre-breakup. And it took months for us to get everybody to rally around and understand that during the investigation. That's one of those things that it would have been much better for all of us going in to have had that level of understanding. Because there were some folks in Texas that were responsible for searching on the ground that in fact had sent people out west to search some of the areas around some of these ghosts or the noise and the radar data, that we could have helped them not put out the effort. We could have told them that they were chasing something that wasn't actually valid data. Our first outreach to the amateur photographers out west, and actually I feel bad almost calling them amateur photographers because these guys have done such a good job, but they all mostly were doing this as a hobby, even though they were very sophisticated in their approach to doing it. But our first outreach to them was to just get the videos themselves, and in many cases we didn't want just copies, we wanted originals, especially for the analog stuff. But as we started doing the analysis and we realized we didn't have enough information to actually understand the exact mass and size of the object, that we had to make an assumption. And the fact that we had to assume either one of those meant we really couldn't confirm what it was that was coming off the orbiter. So one of the things that we decided was, well, if we can get the cameras, we can dismantle the cameras and we can test the chip in the camera that actually measures the light data. And depending on the accuracy of that chip, we might then be able to use that luminosity, or how bright that data is on the chip itself and in the recorded video, to actually estimate mass. If we can estimate mass, or if we can measure the mass, we can tell you exactly the size of the object just based on the ballistics. And again, this was before we had the MADS recorder, so we were pulling on anything extreme like this in the outside chance that it would help us understand what caused the breakup. So then we started reaching out to these photographers and actually asking them to send us their cameras. In many cases, several $1,000s worth of camera equipment, and almost across the board. Actually, with the exception of one fella, every one of them sent the equipment in right away, no questions asked, knowing that we were going to tear it apart. They were not going to get it back, and none of them gave us any static. All they sent it to us, and we tore them apart. What we found was that the data still, with the shuttle being as far away as it was and as small as the object was, the fact that it only took up 1 or 2 pixels, even on these really expensive cameras, it meant we really couldn't get the luminosity data out that we needed to measure the mass that would then allow us to tell the folks doing the investigation how large the object was. It was heartwarming to me, though, that the outpouring from this group of photographers. I mean, one, not only did they share their data right away, they then shared their equipment with us right away, knowing we were going to tear it apart. And on their own, they were doing their own analysis and reviewing our analysis and backing it up and coming up with their own judgments on what they thought of our analysis. I mean, these guys, they could not have helped us more. It was tremendous. So as we started pulling on the various sources of data, like radar data, the Department of Defense showed up with a handful of folks, led by a general from NORAD. And their offer was to provide all data to us that was at their disposal, classified and unclassified, with the intent to take classified data if possible and declassify it so that we could use it out in the broader engineering community. So one of the things that I did through my team was I acted as our liaison back into this community. And it was I guess, convenient for us that I had come from that part of the Air Force before I worked for NASA. I had clearances and actually had previous experience in some of the systems that we were reaching into and trying to use data from. After a couple of weeks, we were still having trouble communicating. We weren't getting a lot of the data, and we were trying to get everything from military air traffic control radar to military defense radars, like the radars we use on the coast to detect missiles, incoming missiles, things like that, to various types of satellite data. In fact, we even reached out to NOAA and some sound recordings NOAA makes continuously while listening for things like nuclear detonations. We were having trouble getting that data, and I would say by the second week or so of the accident investigation, I had reported in a public telecon at the agency level that we were having trouble getting this data out of the Air Force and out of the DoD. And within a day or two, an Air Force colonel named Jack Anthony showed up and says, "Hey, my boss tells me that you're not happy, that NASA's not happy, we're not helping you guys with the investigation. I'm here to get you anything that you need." And so Jack and I sat down and kind of went through the laundry list. Here's the types of data we're looking for. We really are looking for this needle in the haystack. In some cases, we don't really know what we're looking for. We're looking for all data so that we can have a look and determine, is there something in there that will help us understand what caused the breakup of the vehicle? And so as he and I would talk, and he was much more connected, especially in the classified world in the Air Force, than I ever was, which meant he could listen to me on what it is we were looking for, and he could then understand, oh, okay, I know what you need to get. You don't even know it exists, but I know where to go look. And he and I would have conversation after conversation where he would get this look on his face and say, oh, I see what you're looking for. Let me go away and make some phone calls. I'll come back and let you know if it's possible. And more times than not, he came back and said, here's the type of information I'm going to be able to get you. It's going to take a few hours because it has to go through a few levels of scrubbing to declassify it and to take things out of it that we will not be able to declassify, but then I'll be able to get you this type of data. Does that help? And it was a godsend, actually, and brought all kinds of data to us. Most of it, unfortunately, was data that we were not able to tease enough technical information out to fully understand what happened to the vehicle. But it all did kind of contribute to painting a picture that without the MADS recorder, we might have actually relied on for other things. But in the end, we were able to do a really good analysis of all the Air Force radar data, various types of Air Force satellite data. There was some imagery that was taken at Maui and at Kirtland Air Force Base, all of which we were able to declassify that we used for some part of the investigation or another. And actually Jack Anthony was the real key for reaching into the Air Force, sort of as their trusted agent that helped us find all this data and to be able to ask for things that on the NASA side we didn't even know existed. But he trusted us. He was able to understand what it is we needed, and then he reached in and pulled that data out for us, and it worked tremendously. While pulling on a lot of this external data, radar data, the NOAA infrasonic data, Air Force satellite data, et cetera, while most of that was not helpful, would not have actually allowed us to shrink down search footprints out west for pre-breakup debris coming off the orbiter. While that part's true, on the other hand, the significant amount of analysis that we did on the ballistics themselves, pre and post breakup, allowed us to develop software that could propagate those footprints in real time for the first time in our history. Another element that my experts that actually figured out how to do it didn't think it was possible until they started getting close enough to it after having done this analysis. So, you know, on the day of this accident, it took us a couple of hours to generate a footprint that had a significant amount of error. And this is post-breakup, where we had significantly better data to estimate what the breakup footprint would look like. But it took us a couple of hours to generate the first one, and it took several weeks to generate a footprint that was highly accurate, that in fact you could overlay on top of where all the debris was found on the ground in East Texas, and it fits right within this footprint. If we were to have a similar accident today, we would have that footprint available within 30 minutes of the accident, if not in real time, with 95% confidence. And that is a significant improvement going forward for human spaceflight, human-rated vehicles deorbiting. The fact that we have that kind of data, all of it came at a really terrible price from STS-107, but we did get that one good nugget out of it that will serve us well in the future. You know, the interesting lesson I had reinforced during both the ESAT experience and the return to flight was, one, it is easy, especially at the working level, even for folks that are experts in their field, it is sometimes easy to bump up against some analysis, some physical fact as we know it, and conclude, now that we have discovered this, there's no way we can solve this problem because we've looked at this before and we know this isn't possible. And I look at things that we solved during this 2.5-year period after the accident, most of which were considered impossible by the community, most of which were considered impossible by the experts in each one of the technical disciplines. In the ESAT, Chris Edelin absolutely thought he was chasing a rabbit trail and trying to do anything useful with the videography and the photography of the orbiter flying overhead with just these dots. But it was Chris Edelin that came back and said, hey, look at this Venus crossing. Guess what that means? I never would have thought it was possible. And it was the same Chris that just a couple of days ago laughed and said, it's not possible to do what you want us to do with this. And the rest of the folks, largely from our flight dynamics community, that went from that to full ballistics analysis and footprints and chasing this radar data, each one of the guys that solved about 4 different, quote, impossible parts of that challenge, in just a few weeks, they brought in the solution to the thing that each one of them thought was impossible before they started working it. My role leading the team wasn't to solve any one of those impossible things personally. In fact, there's none of the things from the ESAT that I personally was the guy that said, here is the mathematical solution for that. There were things that I was hearing from each one of those individual experts, though, that made me dubious that the thing that they knew to be impossible really was impossible. I heard things from them that made it sound clear to me that there were ways we could get around the problem that they weren't seeing that would allow them to solve it, that I wasn't going to be able to solve, but I might be able to help them look at it differently. And a strong lesson that I will never forget from that experience was just that. As the leader, don't give up. Even when your experts tell you this now is not solvable, there might be a different way to frame it, there might be a different way to look at it, that you still may be able to solve what appears to be an impossible problem. And you know, that 3-month experience in the ESAT, and especially learning that lesson or relearning that lesson, served me extremely well for the next 2 years in leading the return to flight for the MOD team, because we had a lot more impossible problems in front of us for the return to flight. And just like with the ESAT, the individual experts from engineering and from MOD that brought in the solutions, each one of them thought the thing that they solved was impossible when we started in the February-March timeframe of 2003. 2.5 years later, we were flying with those things in space, and they all worked perfectly. So I'm a firm believer that impossible just doesn't exist. We just don't yet understand how to solve the problem differently. But if we really want to solve it, let's figure out how to look at it differently. But it really is only impossible if we stop asking and stop looking for different ways to solve it. You know, a good programmatic lesson for the commercial space industry or any newcomers to human spaceflight or anything else hard like this, be very careful about when you have a contingency, you have some kind of crisis. Be careful about going into it thinking you already know what happened, especially if you don't have enough data to back it up. You're just basing it on intuition or experience, engineering judgment we tend to call it, which is nothing but educated guessing. Be careful when you do that, because going into it with that assumption absolutely limits how you look at the problem. And we did experience that for the first couple of months of the accident investigation, not because the guys at the top that were leading had any intention to not be fully open to anything that happened and to finding out what actually happened to the orbiter, but there was a very strong sense that we knew what happened. We knew that we had some kind of damage on the left main landing gear door. There's no way foam could have damaged the leading edge if it hit it. And those hard over assumptions at the senior level absolutely colored how the rest of the community was pulling data together and pursuing various leads, until we had the MADS recorder. Now, the two things that changed that, getting the MADS recorder and analyzing that data, and the test at Southwest Research that the CAIB had done, where they actually shot a piece of foam through an actual leading edge or an RCC, reinforced carbon section of leading edge. So exactly like a shuttle leading edge. And when they shot that piece of foam through that leading edge with the same conditions that they expected the foam hit Columbia on STS-107, that changed everything in the minds of those senior leaders. And again, the real key takeaway then for anybody else following is be very careful when you go into an investigation like this to not be influencing the people that work for you, to only chase the data that supports what you already think happened. And the trouble is, as a leader, our leaders, I mean, in general, you're not going to go into an investigation intending to do that. That's the insidious part of this. You have to be more deliberate about being aware of this and trying to stay more hands-off and be more open to the unknown unknown.